Thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. Our discussion's being hosted by Indivisible One New Jersey, a coalition of 40 plus local grassroots indivisible groups in New Jersey who work in collaboration to amplify our voices and increase our power through collective action and shared resources. I am Marie Henselder Kimmel, and I'm going to stop share for this here. And we are going to spotlight Christopher and myself. Great. I'm Marie Henselder Kimmel. I'm the leader of an indivisible group, New Jersey Voters Want More Say, here in Camden County, New Jersey. And thanks to Maggie Savoca from One New Jersey 7 for coordinating our tech and helping me out in general. Our discussion tonight serves the purpose of education regarding concepts to help us protect our democracy, and boy, do we need that. To quote our guest tonight, I hope that part of what you take away from tonight is that we are always just a handful of good ideas from changing things for the better. Humans have an astounding capacity for learning, and that process can be what saves us all. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Christopher Armitage, the author of the Existentialist Republic Substack. He was born in Newark, New Jersey, but he's now located in Spokane, Washington. And how long have you been out there, Chris?
Okay, so
There we
sorry, it
go.
wasn't letting
That's
me
okay.
unmute.
Yep.
So I've been in Spokane now. Gosh, I got stationed here when I was in the Air Force when I was 19, and so it's been about 15 years.
Okay, great. But we still consider you a New Jersey boy.
Definitely.
um, so Chris, as he just mentioned, is an Air Force veteran with tours to the Middle East. He's a former law enforcement officer, and he has a master's degree in Homeland Security. He was a 2020 Democratic candidate for Congress from Washington 5th District. Is
Yep.
that correct? Okay. And he was an activist for Black Lives Matter. He's now a journalist and criminal justice research slash public policy researcher, and he's focused on advocating for public policy through his Substack and his academic paper, Oppositional Federalism. That's the basis for our discussion tonight. Chris, can you tell us some more about your background and what led you to your interest in examining opposition to authoritarianism?
Sure. I mean, it really started when I was young. My dad was a city council member in New Jersey. I can't remember exactly where, but he did that, and then was a director of economic development, and then decided to go into the trades and worked in heating, ventilation, and air condition repair. And over a couple year period, we went from Republican Mormons to atheist Democrats. And it was a really fascinating period for me where my parents were becoming very engaged with politics and leaving room for me and my siblings to educate ourselves and make our own decisions. My older brother then became really involved with protesting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I wasn't sure what to do after high school, and so I decided to join the military. And my parents were actually very enthused because they were excited for me to have good health care and all other sorts of benefits. And so I did that. I earned my associate's, bachelor's, and master's degrees while active duty for the near decade that I was in the Air Force. My undergrads are criminal justice and psychology. My graduate degree is in Homeland Security. Since then, I've worked in a few different fields. I worked as a corrections officer briefly for about a year. I've worked in behavioral rehabilitation for behaviorally challenged youth living in foster or who have difficulty maintaining stable placements in foster homes, and I was supervising behavioral intervention for them. I have also worked in politics. I don't think there's been a week or a month in the last decade where I wasn't sitting down with a politician to talk their ear off. And something I try to tell people is everybody's an expert in something that your local representatives should be more well informed on when they make their policy decisions. Over the last so many years, I I've in a lot of ways started to see myself also as an educator. I really love informing people on, civics classes are gone. And so eventually what I ended up doing professionally was somewhere between journalist, activist, and public educator. And I also write model legislation that some of which will be proposed in several state houses over the next year. And I have a personal goal of sitting down and talking to 10%, which is a little over 300 of the state house and state assembly, Democratic state assembly and state house representatives across the country and in the next year. And so that's a lot of what I do now. And I
Right.
write the Existentialist Republic, and we have a few million monthly readers and tons of activists doing daily calls to action that are really fun.
Okay. And then particularly, was there one thing that really sort of lit the fire about the opposition to authoritarianism, or was it just a little bit of everything?
Well, what's interesting is my academic work happened in the opposite direction than academic work usually happens. I since After the 2024 election, I spent several months so heartbroken that I would get upset at anybody for telling me the news and did everything I can to avoid it. I cried so hard the morning after that I had to stop my therapy appointment and reschedule because the therapist was like, "You can take more time if you want," and I was like, "Nope, I could barely talk." But I processed it, and eventually, you have to turn towards the storm if you want to get through it faster. And so I started writing just about the things that were upsetting me and researching. At some of us, probably a lot of people who are here on this call, when life gets upsetting, we're learners. We want to understand it better so we can try to change it or make an impact on it.
Hmm.
And the cognitive behavioral therapy has informed a lot of what has turned into my communication style. And so I would just write about what was happening in the news and what we could do about it. And over time, that sharing process morphed into what the work that I have out right now is a working paper that I'll be submitting in 2 months to the Yale Law Review, and it has to do with the taxonomies of state response to federal authoritarian capture. Taxonomy is just a fancy word for categories, and so I've
Right.
studied the different postures that cities and states maintain towards the federal government throughout U.S. history, from Heather Gerken's initial work in 2009. She's the current dean, actually, of Yale Law. She wrote a paper in 2009 about uncooperative federalism, which is states refusing to provide assistance for federal authorities they don't agree with. And that grew into a 5-tier structure that my 125-page working paper currently covers, which outlines
Right.
existing stuff. And yeah, it's been a really amazing
So,
process.
and actually, and that's how I came across your work, because I'm one of those people who just digs in and reads and reads and reads and reads and tried to figure out and tries to learn and try to say, like, many things that we deal with in our society over the course of years, somebody else has dealt with it someplace else. So why don't we look at what's going on in those other places or those other times to see what was done? Was it effective? Do we have an option here? So that's what attracted me to your work when I first started reading your stuff. Um, and of course, we all want to know what the heck we can do to save our democracy and to counter what's going on. Particularly, we'll get it to the end about what's going on right now here in New Jersey, in Newark. We have this heads butting heads, and a feeling like there's got to be more we can do. There's got to be more we can do. So I would like to do, I'm going to share, I'm going to ask you first to just step back a little bit and just tell us kind of why constitutionally there are powers that the states have that can be used in a situation like this. So
Absolutely.
go ahead, and I'll just go ahead and start sharing while you start talking.
When our nation was founded, there were more checks and balances created than just having a bicameral legislature and a judicial branch and an executive branch with separation of powers. There was also the idea that we would have layered levels of government that each have their own abilities to and responsibilities to their citizens. And the founders were pretty clear that their view was what should come first above all else, and something that made this new government different was going to be the supremacy of human rights, of your rights as a person being more important than the rights of a king or an autocrat or a tyrant of any kind. That was the founding idea that invigorated people to create this nation. And so some of the principles that provide a more robust democracy that is more capable of defending itself against authoritarian capture have to do with that layered governance, because we aren't just a federal government that is supreme above all others. We have many different, thousands of governments that exist in their own way within our government. And so dual sovereignty is an important part of that. It has been affirmed consistently throughout US history. So when people say there is double jeopardy, a lot of people are familiar with that. You watch Law and Order, you say you can't be charged with the same crime twice. Well, you can if it's a state offense and a federal offense. They both are their own government with their own laws, and they're allowed to enforce those laws. They don't lose the right to enforce their laws just because of one or the other. There is a traditional deferment, but when you look at the Fugitive Slave Act, when you look at the when you look at prohibition, you see a lot of instances where there was headbutting between those governments. You also look at the legalization and decriminalization of cannabis as a very contemporary example of state governments and federal governments having an oppositional posture towards that. And part of it is dual sovereignty. Uh, Anti-commandeering, valid exercise. These are basically anti-commandeering is the states cannot be forced to engage with the federal decisions. They can't be required to enforce federal policy, because that would essentially it would end our purpose for having governors, having state legislatures, because they would no longer have a degree of independence and self determination. And so, and then something else you'll hear when I talk about these things, like what cities and states can do to pursue their own direction, is the limits of the supremacy clause. So people will mention the supremacy clause, which is a longstanding doctrine that the federal government, their as long as their activities are lawful, they cannot be impeded or stopped in pursuit of whatever they're doing. That lawful does a lot of work. So when we look at, say, the murder of Renee Good, it took 4 days for Derek Chauvin, previously when he murdered George Floyd, to be arrested and charged. Now it's been months without an arrest or a charge for Jonathan Ross, and the defense that's often used is supremacy clause. But the thing is, if that identical conduct occurred with an officer in the Minneapolis Police Department, they already would have been charged. They already would be getting processed, and so clearly that shows that the supremacy clause doctrine there isn't valid, because it's identical conduct that is not lawful and not appropriate and not necessary for their duties. So the supremacy clause has become also part of the supremacy clause. It does, to be clear, it doesn't protect criminal conduct at all. It's meant to protect civil conduct, or sorry, that's qualified immunity. I got that mixed up. Apologies. It's a qualified immunity where that plays is just that's civil conduct and not criminal. And so that's some of the constitutional basis for state authority.
Right.
Oh,
Okay. So
yeah.
and then we know that now I forget now the DA's name. I think it's Mary Moriarty. She has charged um a federal agent for assaulting someone. But I guess maybe part of the problem in terms of Good and Alex Pretty is that the DOJ is not cooperating, despite the fact that it's going through federal court, that they're supposed to release that evidence to the state, and maybe they have by now, but at least that was the holdup. I think initially, Minnesota was trying to hold on and say, well, okay, we'll wait for you to do your thing, and then the federal government DOJ decided, oh no, we don't need to charge him. So now the state is trying to get that information to proceed with its case, but I think there's some holdup there.
Yeah, well, I'll mention as well that I'm glad that charges have come. There's an officer who was charged in Minneapolis, for example, an ICE officer, because they basically were in a road rage incident while on duty and started waving their gun at another car just because they got cut off in traffic. And so some action has happened, but in the case of Preddy and Good, the thing is, there's far more publicly available evidence right now than there was in many previous cases, like the Derek Chauvin case. There is evidence that isn't being handed over. There's a prosecution memo that the Existentialist Republic put together. It's about 16 pages, and it covers the publicly available evidence and how that matches with several different crimes that could reasonably, based on previous precedent where similar types of evidence were applied and led to charges that were reliably over 40 years. And I've communicated a little bit with their office and with the office of Keith Ellison, but they're they're making the decisions they're making. They haven't been terribly transparent about it. The traditional line
Right.
is they don't want to share information on
A
ongoing
case.
investigations. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get to the tiers of state posture, which is your kind of your next. That's where you well as you can explain to us. That's how you kind of decided to do this architecture. That I think is really helpful.
Yeah.
Bring that
And I'll
slide up.
mention. Thank you very much. Uh, with the tiers, they don't exist purely on their as a panacea. So your state doesn't just enter a tier and it is what they are. There's hundreds of policies and programs enacted in a year, and you can have different postures for different levels. So the five tiers of state constitutional posture, these are things that have existed throughout U.S. history, and you'll find ongoing precedent from them as recently as governors like Governor Pritzker refusing to provide resources to help with ICE, and then cannabis legalization and decriminalization as another posture. So tier zero is cooperative federalism. That's the foundation. That's the state and the federal government working together cooperatively. Tier one, uncooperative federalism. Don't That's not assisting enforcement. We don't agree with what you're doing, so we're not going to help you. Tier two is soft secession. You can also think of it as financial independence. It's parallel institutions being created to allow functioning despite federal misconduct. So that's insulation and protection. For example, Social Security is under attack. A tier two soft secession policy would be creating a state level alternative for that. A lot of what I promote with soft secession as well falls under the umbrella of public option everything, which is public creation of revenue generating products and services for the people in that state to maintain a robust social safety net and strong financial health. Tier three is oppositional federalism. That's states using their sovereign criminal powers offensively. That one is less common. It's a challenging posture to have because it really involves bringing the federal government to task and saying, just like if you get a DUI in our state, we're not going to, if Kash Patel gets a DUI in New Jersey, you don't call the Department of Justice, you don't call the FBI, you let the sheriff handle that or the local police department. There isn't a doctrine in U.S. law. You're not going to find laws that say that they have that just because it's a corruption related charge that it all of a sudden has to fall to the federal government if the state has standing. And a lot of where you'll see that tier three oppositional federalism is when you look at the prohibition era when there were federal agents and officers who would commit like drive-by shootings during the Fugitive Slave Act period pre-Civil War, where there were even officers charged with abduction. Tier four is constitutional noncompliance. That's states refusing to comply with unconstitutional federal demands that can involve intervention. So that's actively getting in the way. An example of that would be if you knew that there were actual, true, literal, very human rights, violating concentration camps, people being killed in mass, really, really serious, severe crimes. That's a time where you have an obligation to intervene and step in and stop that from happening. And so those are the five tiers of state constitutional posture to deal with autocratic capture at the federal level.
Okay, and thanks for like sprinkling in some of the historical examples, as we kind of move along there. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, uncooperative federalism here in New Jersey, our previous Attorney General Matt Platkin had it was called the Immigrant Trust Directive, where he directed all the local, state and municipal police, law enforcement authority, that they were not to do ICE's work for them. Don't assist enforcement. Now that's been codified. Unfortunately, parts of it were not codified, but at least most of it was codified into law since January. Is that's correct, right? That would be in
Absolutely.
uncooperative federalism. Okay,
Yeah,
and then
absolutely. And also lawsuit like civil suits and injunctions, so non-criminal
okay,
interventions that are legal
that's
would
all in the
also have.
uncooperative federalism. Okay, and then soft secession, parallel institutions. Um, I think I'll wait because I have like on the other slide about the public bank. But what are some other, like, have you seen any other states do the soft secession sort of posture?
Absolutely. It happens in a scattered way. I mean, North Dakota has their public bank, and that allows them to self fund different social safety net projects. Every state has some degree of it. It's really just a counter to extreme centralization of governance. It's states saying we're going to create like school lunch programs are their own soft secession. They're saying, we don't need you. Tier one, we don't have to help you. Tier two is we can create our own self-sufficiency so that we're insulated from what you're doing. So school lunch programs, state assistance to provide people who are impoverished or to help them find housing, that the federal programs can exist, but it's the states doing that on their own. And more, advanced soft secession would involve, say, like I said, replacing SSI since it's under attack, or creating an alternative or parallel as the school system comes under attack, creating school programs where you're not engaging with federal subsidies, because that comes with strings attached. You're saying
Hmm.
we're just going to figure out how to self-fund our own programs, and if you can do it while generating revenue. One example of that also would be the creation of, just like the Bank of North Dakota is a revenue generating business, but it's owned by the state. You could do that with a public option for healthcare, where it's created and structured in a way where you are careful about how many high income earners you bring in, and those help fund people who get their healthcare completely for free. And so it's imagine it's a business that also, part of the business's goal is to make sure that it provides a completely free resource for people who need a stronger social safety net.
And if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure if Massachusetts 100% fits that, but they do have a public auction, because that's where Obamacare started, right? Quote unquote. It was based on Massachusetts plan. And if I'm not mistaken, Hawaii's plan also is very similar to that, also in terms of healthcare.
Yeah, well, and in New York City, actually, they have a program. I believe it's called Metro Plus, and
Right.
it was created in the 80s. It was a huge win, and it's a HMO, but it also works with the city hospitals, because the city has some hospitals. And they 90%, when they first created it, the private enterprises were very concerned about a public option that competed with them, right? Because why would they want competition that's trying to serve the public interest? And so they put a cap on it, and they said 90% of the clients that work with Metro Plus, 90% of those clients have to be on some sort of government healthcare plan like Medicare or Medicaid, but 10% of them can just be people who are paying clients and generate revenue for the city. And very easily they could uncap it. It's a profitable program, so they could just use the revenue that's generated from that to build more hospitals and take on more low income clients. And all it would take is just uncapping it. It's a very successful program.
Great. Okay, I think that really helps. And I just and I really, it intrigued me too when I read and you pointed out tonight that so many states have already legalized cannabis, right? Well, still federally, it's illegal, but so many states have decided to legalize cannabis. So that's red state and blue state. Then of course, on the immigration side, you have a lot of the liberal the blue states and blue cities that have created sanctuary areas for immigration control so that they won't definitely won't assist ICE. And then on the other hand, in the red states where there are second quote unquote Second Amendment sanctuary areas or sanctuary states, I guess. So the red states and the blue states both have used this through the
Yeah,
course of our history and even currently.
absolutely. There's precedent for all of this. My work is just identifying a structure to it, putting it into categories, and then explaining how those categories can be moved into a public policy suite that helps. On your tier two is more about reducing harm reduction from mismanagement and corruption. Tiers one and three are more about decreasing the power that the federal government has. And the more states and cities that engage in it, the harder it is for them to split their resources. Because while the federal government is very powerful on its own, as soon as two states are actively engaged in more, purposefully implementing these structures, all of a sudden the federal government is splitting all of their resources in two. And as we see with the cannabis decriminalization and legalization, what can happen is a nullification where it just takes too many resources for it to feel worth their time.
Okay. And I think the other thing I wanted when I first read this, let me just share that slide again if I can. Um, that I was thinking, well, how does one tier sort of build and go into the next one? But that's not correct. That they don't happen in a continuum. They really each one of these things can be happening in a particular state at the same time. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Even in a very, purposeful, directed use of this system, you are still going to be cooperating with the federal government on programs. So no matter how aggressive your posture is, a city and a state have hundreds of different plans, programs, policies that they are engaging with the federal government on. Most of those, it's totally logical for them to remain in tier zero. Part of this is also meant to create space to pivot towards a friendlier posture if need be. You can be tier one when it comes to immigration enforcement, but if your schools are operating fine with the federal government, then stick with tier zero on that. Tier two, that's very that's very item dependent. It's your state just saying we're going to try and actively create more policies that help strengthen our economy, make us more economically solvent, protect us from mismanagement of the economy. And with tier two, I'll also mention that's those policies. It's more like like tier one. Think of it like quiet quitting. Tier two, think of it like you have maybe a second job, or even while you're at your first job, you're trying to see if you can do work that helps you eventually be able to leave that job, or that sort of thing. And then tier three is just using the law. It's using criminal justice as a means for trying to take up the space that has been ceded by the federal government in the DOJ and the FBI actively helping cover up and do the dirty work of an autocratic regime. So they all have different spaces they operate. They don't need to build on one another, and none of them occupies all policies.
And can you give us an example of something that's in tier four? That one's a little hard for me. Even I'm like, okay, well, what is that? Is that secession? I mean, what is constitutional noncompliance, but you're still in the federal system? What's an
Tier
example of
four is
that?
the truly the most confrontational. All of these are meant to minimize confrontation, minimize it's harm reduction for an autocratic takeover. But tier four is when something becomes so horrible that you are ready to, part of how I'd explain it is if the Supreme Court makes decisions that are so blatantly partisan and harmful to the people that a state would have an obligation to disobey them. So with corruption or any sort of thing, you'd say we're going to create a policy that is actively against that, and if you try to do that here, we may intervene. So with ICE detention facilities, we have to ask ourselves, and I encourage people to talk when you talk to politicians to ask them is how severe would the situation need to be for us to intervene? Another example of a tier four policy would be something that we've proposed at the Existentialist Republic, which is a red line law that says if the federal government does X, Y, or Z to interfere with our elections, so that would be something so blatantly unconstitutional that just taking them to court isn't sufficient, because that could take months, years, and by then you haven't stopped the takeover, right? So if they send federal troops into polling stations, if they nullify your results, if they don't respect your results, if they try to cancel elections, this law would trigger and go into effect upon that transgression happening. And then it would order every private business, every employer to move all funds that they hold on to for employees and that they pay to the federal government. So all federal withholdings would then be handed to the state government, and then the state government would be the arbiter of handing that money to the federal government should the constitutional order be restored. So it's a non-confrontational economic lever that, again, the most confrontational. You're saying this constitutional order has been broken in such an extreme way that to comply with it would be a problem. It could also be if you hear about the horrible enough things happening in the ICE facilities that, the Hague, like war crimes would actually be relevant punitively for, say, your governor, if they knew something was happening and did not choose to use the National Guard, choose to use the state law enforcement to go and intervene.
Mhm.
Does
So
that clear it up?
it helps me. And so you have four pieces of model legislation, and this is one of them, right? Where basically it's to say this is something that the government might try to progress to do. They might try to send in federal agents. They might try to seize our ballots. They might try to seize our voting machines. So to stop them from doing that or to threaten them so that they'll know that this is coming if they try to do that. We're going to set up this trigger law. And boy, have we seen trigger laws, right, in the red states regarding things that they wanted to achieve against women's rights and reproductive rights and so on and so forth. But we've set up this trigger law and say, if you have federal agents go to polling places, if you try to seize our ballots, if you try and spell out what it is, what are the red lines, then we will, then all employers in our state, all whatever entities must send all federal taxes to this escrow account, and we will hold those taxes from the federal government, from feeding the federal government until you then return to constitutional order, and at which time we'll start sending them back to the federal government. That it's that kind of an idea.
Absolutely. And just so you know, that particular piece of model legislation and a lot of the legislation and strategies that I share come from often a conservative, like manufactured threats. So that particular piece of model legislation was proposed in different forms by Republicans in 4 different states during the Obama administration because they saw him as such a tyrant. And so they had these manufactured fears of him taking over. And so they wrote these laws saying, if you steal our elections, we're going to not give you our tax dollars. And so it's a point where you might say, we're going to do a thing that is technically not allowed, it might be over the line, but the order has been broken so blatantly that we have an obligation to take, severe measures that might be considered illegal or against the supremacy clause.
Okay, with a trigger. All right. And then what were the just brief topic, the other three pieces of model legislation, what were the topics for those?
So there's the Means Testing Corporate Welfare Act, which is another strategy to get corporate money out of elections, and it also comes with financial benefits. So, and it's arguably more robust against legal challenges than some of the strategies that Hawaii and other states are taking, but all good. Let's do all of them. So the Means Testing Corporate Welfare Act is saying if you accept if your corporation contributes to political campaigns or political action committees or anything like that, then you are disqualified from receiving government contracts or corporate subsidies or any taxpayer dollars. Because if you have enough money to contribute to politics, we don't want you using our tax dollars to impact results. And that's actually based off of existing legislation for preventing contractors usually from doing exactly that. But it's the same thing corporations are doing.
Mhm.
Another piece of model legislation is the Child Sex Trafficking Investigation Act. So that one creates task forces that are meant to investigate the the Epstein files, the publicly available information, and call in people for depositions and try to build out information beyond to see if there's anything that can be discovered that intersects with state criminal law. And if it finds something that's relevant for another state, it sends it to that other state. And so what you would have then is a dozen, 2 dozen states actively calling in people like, Donald Trump or whomever, asking them to come in for depositions. And it could also lead to members of the FBI and DOJ and even leadership for different departments being investigated for violations at the state level for obstruction of justice and
Mhm.
other fraud and other sorts of crimes like that and trying to
So,
cover it
so,
up.
so essentially, that would be a piece of legislation that would cover what Fannie Willis did in in Atlanta
Yes, it
after the
would
fact,
create,
right? It would
absolutely.
create a
Yes.
commission that would do that sort of investigation.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly that.
Okay.
Yeah. And then our fourth piece of model legislation, I'm trying to remember it right now. I'm forgetting. Is there any chance you have it in front of you? I can't believe
No, I
I can
don't.
pull
I
it up
didn't.
real quick.
I didn't put that in front
Uh,
of me.
Sorry, let me
Okay.
pull
Well,
that up
we'll.
real quick.
Uh,
Here we go. Sorry, we can move on to if you want, but I'd love to have it up.
yeah. Go ahead. Just if you have it, if it's easy to pull up, go ahead and pull it up. Off the top of my head,
Definitely.
I. It's just so these are all kind of ideas that we can, and obviously, we as activists in New Jersey would need to look at these things and say, hey, are these things that could potentially be applicable to situation here? Some of the
Absolutely.
next
Let's
thing I'm
see.
gonna.
So Corporate welfare. Oh, the Bribe is a Bribe Act. Now,
Oh,
existing legislation exists that covers corruption in a way that's much more robust than at the federal level. The Roberts Court has had a very concerted effort to continue to interpret corruption, bribery, those sorts of things in a smaller and more narrow way. Under dual sovereignty, states still are fully entitled to enforce their corruption legislation. And if they wanted to say, we think Donald Trump is in violation of North Carolina's corruption statutes, and this is why we think we have standing, they could take it to task. But this legislation would actually be to fully outline that nobody is immune to it, create task forces whose whole job is investigating federal corruption, or not federal, sorry, all corruption. All the things that we currently see as a problem that a patchwork of states have as expectations for their state level, but it would do that at the federal level, and it just has to outline the things that are very clearly influence peddling that we see, as a problem. And because we know that the FBI isn't going to do this anymore, we know that the DOJ isn't going to do it anymore, and while state statutes currently exist, doing it as an official piece of legislation that says a bribe is a bribe, and this is how we define it, and if to a reasonable person it looks like corruption, like the emoluments clause issues that are happening, then we can just states can say we have standing to pursue this criminally.
okay. Great. I think obviously there are a lot of reasons we would want to consider better enforcement of corruption in New Jersey, unfortunately. So let me just go because I did do a slide. Let's see, that was a little bit New Jersey centric, and then a key question is, what about this situation with Delaney? I'm sorry. Let me get that slide advanced before I try to share it. Too many. Too many screens to go back and forth. Here we go. Okay, here. Share and there we go. All right. So, in terms of opposition to federal overreach, there's a little bit of good news. And I actually mentioned this before that we had through previous Attorney General, the Immigrant Trust Directive, saying that local law enforcement was not to enforce federal immigration from Trump 1.0 when there was overreach. And that was used, and now it's been codified with Trump 2.0 here. In addition, since Governor Sherrill was inaugurated in January, she declared an executive order against ICE being on state-owned and operated property. And subsequent to that, I'm very proud to say that my county, Camden County, is one of the several counties. I think we're up to 6 now that have done countywide resolutions that ICE is prohibited from using counties' property and operated property. And then you actually brought up in a post just a couple days ago that it's an older piece of legislation that we had instituted limits on PFAS in our water here in New Jersey, and I'll let you share the good news on that one.
Yeah, Rutgers just did a study and found that the legislation that New Jersey passed reduced PFAS levels by about 60%, somewhere between 55 and 60%. So New Jersey did a good job on that. And I'll also tell people when you learn about those good things, and I need to do more to celebrate them and tell people about them. Try and see if you can find out who in your state house or whoever was part of that and send them a thank you, because it's good. You want to have the carrot and the stick, not just one or the
Right,
other. So good job, New Jersey.
right, absolutely. And of course, now we have an EPA that doesn't believe in any contamination of anything and is rolling all of this stuff back. So it's really important that we have it because that's still in place. So, particularly, there were some little tidbits in some of your recent posts about things that maybe New Jersey would be applicable in New Jersey. And one um, gave I definitely celebrated when I saw it was, do you want to tell us about accountability for a Supreme Court justice that's particularly applicable
Justice
here in New
Alito.
Jersey? Yes.
Justice Alito, yes. So his conduct receiving huge gifts Now, at the federal level, the Supreme Court has ruled the narrow interpretation that these are gratuities, but there are several different ways that you can look at these gifts that he's received and his lack of recusals. We're talking about a judge who regularly receives lavish and expensive items from people with vested interests in his court and never recuses. It can be argued, and has been argued in courts before, that these are not gratuities or gifts. They should count as income. That this is related to his job in the court. So while you could pursue that route, you can also concurrently pursue various influence peddling and even RICO related, organized crime related statutes for criminally charging Samuel Alito, because there is precedent. You can find cases of judges doing materially identical conduct and ending up at least removed from the bench and even incarcerated before. And so, at least investigating these things, if we have publicly available information that looks like somebody with a position of power is receiving long-term, lavish, expensive gifts, that sounds like a bribe. And while I haven't looked over New Jersey's corruption statutes, there are multiple law. I did for that article look up some of the tax-related ones and some of the bribery related ones. And I mentioned them in the article, but I'm not remembering them off the top of my head right now.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you that there's room for criminal referrals and investigations on the subject, because what we have publicly, there's enough information for us to be able to say we need to look deeper in the public interest.
So those are things that we could potentially be sending word to our Attorney General, Jen Davenport, and saying, hey, we really think so much is going on. We really think you should investigate. You should at least look at these things to see about investigating for potential criminal charges in those
Yeah, well, when
situations. It may be that the statutes don't uphold, don't withstand the scrutiny and with the information, but at least at least the investigation needs to be considered.
it's very clear that the public is interested in a restoration of justice. They don't want to see a lower bar for the people in power. And that means that we need to treat these as the most important cases to investigate, not the least. And
Yeah.
so, as the voters, we need to tell our governors, talk to the governor too, talk to the AG, because governors can make case referrals. We saw with Hillary Clinton days before the election, a press conference saying that investigations were being opened again. We saw the son of a sitting president having intimate, private, unlawfully captured photos paraded around Congress. We've seen so much weaponization against innocent people. And again, that is a lot of what I'm sharing here, is understanding that the tactics that have been used to capture this system can be ethically applied to restore justice and law and order. But we need to make it clear to these politicians that civil suits aren't going to be sufficient, and that the AG is there to act as the people's attorney. And so this is what we want. We want them investigating potential criminal conduct from the most powerful people in the country and learning if there is standing.
And then additionally, something that's not criminal, but Samuel Alito holds a law license in New Jersey, and there's an office of it's attorney ethics, and I forget
Yes.
exactly the term for it, but basically that's something where we as citizens have the ability to say he's done this, he's done this, he's done that. He hasn't declared these gifts until it's been pointed out to him, and then he's declared only the ones that were pointed out, and then if something else came up, and then he finally declared that we can say we would like, that these are ethical violations. We would like his law license, the bar to examine his law license.
And he would still be on the court, but it'd get him in the history books, and it would build a record for impeachment. And that's some of what this is as well. Is we know the information that is out in broad daylight, but we don't know what's uncovered, and usually it's much worse. And so, pursuing every avenue we can for justice and investigation is how we restore law and order. And it doesn't disallow federal measures should enough seats be won at the federal level, or there be changes in who the president is. This all facilitates future justice, and it gives us something to do in the interim. And we need to pursue every avenue possible. And so the bar, the Office of Ethics, is a huge part of that. And we need to apply that pressure right now. The piece that I did on Justice Roberts and my filing for his disbarment, that if you Google John Roberts, you'll find info about that and people talking about it. And these people largely hide from the public view and share the appearance of being upstanding, and this is the path towards gaining some accountability.
Yeah. Just for those of you who may not have read any of Christopher's stuff, that he has a recent, actually today's post was again about Roberts, but there's also a post about Justice Thomas and possible tax violations for Virginia, and I think some ethics stuff for Virginia as well. And now, the other thing on the slide, the next thing for New Jersey was the potential trigger law in terms of the elections. We discussed that already, so I'm going to skip over that. And then I think at this point, let's try to move on to well, two things. First of all, for those of you who have a particular question, maybe put question next to it and in the chat, and just write out what your question is. And yeah, Susan wrote in California disbarred John Eastman for his vote stealing strategy. Several of those attorneys were disbarred. So yeah, so if anybody has a question for Christopher, but first I'm going to ask him. I kind of sent him some of the articles about what's going on at Delaney, and the only thing I have to say is I was busy getting ready for this. I don't know if there are any new developments today. I do know that Marty, I'm going to have you write your question in the chat, please. We're not going to unmute people, just whatever. So the hunger strike and labor strike has been going on since Friday. 300 detainees before that had snuck out a letter saying, we don't get medical care. We are held. If we ask for medical care, it takes days. There's worms in our food. There's spoiled food. There's rotten food. There's not enough food. We can't get in touch with our attorneys. We're held here. We don't know what's going to happen. Just basically a violation of due process. They snuck that out last week. Then they were asking for a visitation with Governor Sherrill and to be let out, basically, to be able to have due process. Started their hunger and labor strike on Friday night because they're allowed to work for $1 an hour, or sometimes they don't get paid at all, but they're allowed to work for Geo Corporation, who runs it. Yay for them. Anyhow, there's been some interactions. Representative Menendez and Senator Andy Kim, were able to visit on Saturday. And then I know Representative McIver and Analia Meja and Menendez went to the Elizabeth Detention Center on Sunday because the lead protester, the lead hunger striker, was moved to another facility. Then Andy Kim was with the crowd trying to talk to them or whatever, and they were trying to block vans from leaving, and he was talking to the crowd, asking them to move, and the crowd and Andy Kim were pepper sprayed and pepper balled. So our senator was pepper sprayed, and then last night there were a couple of violent takedowns of protesters who were across the street, weren't interacting with ICE, and so on and so forth. And the governor has said she tried to go, she tried to be let. Nope, they refused to let her in. And well, we're going to hold them accountable. She made a statement, but nothing's been done so far. So
Yeah.
what kind of
Well,
things have you seen done? Because you were in Minneapolis. Christopher was on the ground in Minneapolis for a while. So he saw some of the interactions that happened and some of the things that were done in Minneapolis.
yeah, Minneapolis was a really valuable learning lesson. I went for a week after Renee Good was murdered and a week after Alex Preddy was murdered. While I was there, I met with state house and state senate representatives. I met with a candidate for county prosecutor. I met with activists with quite a few different organizations. I attended the general strike, one of the general strikes. I attended a sort of parade protest type thing. I went regularly to the Hennepin County building where the people were being held. I attended, just a ton of different events. It was amazing. And what I saw that was really good was a sort of mosaic of activism that I think should be replicated with even some additional things. So the doing general strikes regularly and just having an invitation, getting a hold of unions and just saying, look, this one day each month we're calling for it and we'll be out and about.
So,
Getting
so just so you're no, so you're aware, there actually is the immigrant justice community is has been on the ground. There's a lot of mutual aid that goes on there continuously for the families that are trying to visit and for the families that are outs have been basically holding vigil outside. Um, and I think around the state, there's been support. Could there be more support in some cases? Definitely. But in terms of the state, like the oppositional federalism part of it, like what did you see anything happen in Minneapolis that really falls into that um, aspect of it?
Unfortunately, not that one. There has been painfully little done. I still the prosecution memo that we released for Renee Good outlines the facts, sufficient evidence to put Jonathan Ross away for 40 years. Part of that strategy was undercharging rather than overcharging and just going for max time that can be given for that crime. But we didn't. All the progress we saw was from the people. It was from the public, the courage, the increasing energy. I spoke to someone who was recently in Ukraine, and I was shocked by how similar their experience was to what I saw in Minneapolis. In the sense that despite these terrible circumstances, the community was more motivated and more united and more, gained energy, was gaining energy and not being beaten down. And that is actually a surprisingly common thing. And when I was studying Homeland Security, one of the things you learn is under disasters and outside threats, it can be when communities come together and are really invigorated because
Right.
they recognize how important coming together is. But I wish I could report good news on the oppositional federalism front. I think it's going to take a few elections and a lot of public education before we're seeing real justice because they don't want to hold their own accountable. That just is what it is, whether it's law enforcement or politicians. They're apprehensive because even if you're not in on the grift, you might have friends who are, or donors who are.
So the additional, and I'm seeing it in a couple of the questions, is how come the governor wasn't granted access, just the congressional representatives? It's a private, it's run by GO. Initially, New Jersey in the last 4 years had passed a law to say that private prison corporations were not allowed, were prohibited, but the DHS took them to court and federal court overturned that law. So our law that there are no private prisons in New Jersey has been wiped away. So they went and they opened before they had the city's health inspectors and so on, because there were some concerns about the building and about the adequacy of the facilities and so on and so forth. It had been empty for a while, but Geo and ICE just went in there and they opened it up, and they have not let any city inspectors in or any state fire inspectors they haven't let in. They're violating all kinds of local ordinances in terms of safety, human safety. And then, of course, they're violating the civil rights of the people that are being detained. So I guess the question would be, in terms of this framework, like what types of things, like I was thinking, okay, so if they can say, well, it's a federally operated private contract, and so therefore they can say that the governor can't go in there, doesn't she still have, I mean, it's in her state. Isn't there still, it just seems like there still should be a way to I guess it would have to be really confrontational. She'd have to take like the National Guard with her and the state police with her and say, "You're letting me in, and I'm surrounded the police," or something like that, which I don't see happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean that's when you start getting into tier 4 response where you would have to go to. I mean, and I tell people too, of course, nobody wants to have, the National Guard standing eye to eye with ICE and basically just saying, look, our orders are to not let you through. And that doesn't mean you have to send guns. It doesn't mean people need to be getting arrested on the spot. Um, and, like one option is just fines, developing fines that can be ongoing and just saying we're just going to charge you this much money as long as you won't let us do X,
Mm.
Y, and Z. Another option is sending out, the National Guard, et cetera, police officers. And, in LA, they did something really interesting. They have police officers accompanying the agents and they have their body cams on and they're supposed to at least find out the team leaders information. I would say it'd be better to say we're going to send our officers out and they're going to actually, each of you, they're going to get your ID on video and make it clear who's who, and they're going to be just present during this operation. New York City is working on a paid force of watchers, with professional training and protections. And so, but there's not a ton of options here. We're really in a tough position, and that's part of why it's important that we start saying, how can we oppose this moving forward? How can we, we're refusing aid at least, but there's really horrific human rights abuses happening, and it's really difficult figuring out what we're going to do about it. But sending troops out, having a presence too, making it clear to them that we're not, we're trying to identify officers when we can, um, and officially make a plan for what we're going to do about it. But it's tough. It's a really difficult situation, and we can't pretend it isn't.
There is a piece of legislation, and I don't remember the name of it, but it was introduced to suggest that um, private prison corporations that operate in New Jersey have to pay a 50% tax on their profits.
I love that.
Um, yes, wouldn't that be wonderful? And that's part of this. That would be where in the tier? Would that be, I guess, would that be oppositional federalism or?
Yeah, I'd call that oppositional federalism because you're creating a disincentive that actively works against the behavior rather than sort of refusing assistance and using criminal and civil means to discourage a behavior. And
Okay.
I love that too because it's revenue generating, and where we can do that to help bolster our abilities, especially as funding gets messed with, that's important.
Yeah, so it's A New Jersey A4077. Thanks, Rosalie, for yeah. Assemblywoman Katie Brennan had sponsored that, and yes, Dawn
Well,
brings up that we did pass a law banning face masks for law enforcement, but now DOJ and whatever DHS is there's actually a lawsuit about that, Dawn. Um, so right now there's an injunction against it. They can't. They're still allowed to wear masks.
Well, part of the
Um,
tier four response too there would be actually having law enforcement slash National Guard go out at the same time where these officers or the ICE agents are. And if they're masked, their instructions are to presume that they're not federal agents until they identify themselves and do that with body cams. And again,
there
that's an
you
aggressive
go.
posture, but
There you go.
I mean, it's easy to just wait for the next election when you're an attorney general, but because also they only invite risk onto themselves by fighting back in a substantive way, and, and that's what we need.
Let me just see. How can we, Amari had a good question. How can we effectively plan with other blue states? There are blue coalitions happening based on different issues, climate, immigration, healthcare for certainly public health, the vaccine recommendations and the public health. How can we do that to help people that are targeted, like
You
this
know,
immigration, people of color,
you
LGBTQ?
you go in the reverse direction on the tier framework. So like there's uncooperative federalism. What you can do is you can create cooperative agreements between states, even if they're unofficial. For soft secession, you can say, hey, we're building a state level alternative that generates its own revenue to replace SSI. And if other states want to participate, you are welcome to. Public option, everything being a great part of that. The Bank of North Dakota doesn't just have to operate in North Dakota. And so if there's a state wanted to create a public option healthcare plan that was able to generate its own revenue, they could partner with other states on that, and it's a fantastic. But also, but you don't have to. It's good to do that, but it's also good. You can just do it on your own, and then you don't need to prohibit cooperation because there's so many things to slow all of this down. And I think the best thing we can do is just get after it in every direction we can. Flood the zone with
Yeah.
good things.
Yeah. And there have been other, like I think in Trump 1.0, sort of the um, greenhouse gas. There was at least in this area in the Northeast, there's a greenhouse gas collaboration among several states about limiting greenhouse gases. And then, Biden came in. So I think a little of the attention went away. And of course, now Trump has disallowed a lot of the wind farms and that sort of thing, that those that were really moving along. So
Well, and
there
I'll tell
are.
you too, California has done a lot of great work in the tier two soft secession model, and they've been able to impact the nationwide requirements on cars, for example, safety expectations, because they have such a big economy that if they institute a requirement for safety, that then the auto manufacturers, it's cheaper for them to just do it nationwide. Well, if more states are doing that, then that has the same impact.
Right. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else that's coming up. We're getting a little bit after the half hour. Do you have a couple more minutes, Chris?
Oh yeah, I do definitely.
Okay, great.
One
Oh,
other
those are
thing
the
too, I
good
just want to
things.
mention.
Yeah.
One other thing for people who are out there, protesting and that sort of thing, I really want to encourage you to do something called like I haven't thought of a good name for it yet, but like activist pairing or action pairing. That's where in Minneapolis, what we did was we printed these posters, and it had explicit information with phone numbers for the governor, the AG, and the Hennepin County attorney. And it gave explicit, really clear general scripting about like, hey, if you want justice for Renee Good, call and email these numbers and tell them how you feel about it and tell them who you are and why you care. And we didn't just pass those out at the events and encourage people to send the call, send the email right then and there. We also had people spread them around their neighborhoods because there's a lot of people who want to be doing something about it and they don't know where to start. And just having a flyer on their door or on their windshield is a great way to spread the word on that.
Yeah. And I think, especially the indivisible groups, I know, we do share calls to action and calls into our Congress people for sure. And to some extent, obviously, a lot of us participated in the boycott of Disney and ABC when Jimmy Kimmel was put off the air, other types of actions like that. But I think you're right. I think, we need to really start putting the pressure as a group across the state. I think we really need to start putting more pressure on our state electeds and our governor and our AG to step up and be creative and do something additional as much as they can. There's got to be more things that they can do a little bit outside the box using this kind of oppositional tension that's under the federal system. I believe so anyway.
Yeah, well, and there's precedent. It happened before, and Republicans have never stopped doing it. Even during the Biden administration, the Texas, they decided to just ignore a Supreme Court order and ignore a Supreme Court ruling about doing work on the border. Uh,
Yeah.
there's states in the country right now that are putting, religious education as part of public school curriculum. And I just don't think it's reasonable that only the bad actors are allowed to push the envelope for what's right and what's wrong, because what's right and what's wrong matters more than the orders of a corrupt court. And people say, but what about the precedent? What if they start doing it? They've been doing it. They've never stopped doing it.
Yeah. And, I think probably part of what a lot of us have observed is that when when the administration comes into conflict with over one of these things, the ones, as we know, the white shoe law firms and the universities that immediately said, "Oh yes, 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 we'll follow what you want us to do because then you'll stop bothering us." No, then there was another ask and another ask and another intrusion, another intrusion, and the law firms and the universities that didn't do that were in better standing and are in better standing. And so that's just a minor example of how you can't let a bully push you around. If they give them your lunch money once, then they're going to keep coming after your lunch money, and the next thing they're going to want is your backpack too, right? You have to
Yeah.
step up and start kind of setting the boundary and then pushing the boundary the other way to a certain extent. And I think
On our
my
city.
observation. Go
Mhm.
ahead.
Oh, go ahead, please. No, please you.
I was just going to say, I think the blue states, I think Democrats in general, liberals for sure, we have looked at the federal government and the Constitution as okay, we have it fixed now. We have all these things in place that are going to keep everything in good form. And we have just looked at when the red states have used this kind of oppositional federalism type of action, we've looked at it like, oh, they're annoying, they're doing whatever, but they were using a power they had, and we've kind of left those, as you said, left those tools in the toolbox. We haven't chosen to go back and say, hey, you know what? I have something other than a hammer here. I have whatever other instrument you want to say you have. Got to use them. We got to recognize that we have them, and we have to start using them.
Absolutely. And we have so much power. I've been meeting with a lot of indivisible groups, and the frustration over lack of traction at the federal level, it's tough. I've talked to U.S. senators, I've talked to governors, and they have so many people trying to get their attention, so many interests. But at the local level, indivisible groups can be wildly powerful. If turning that attention effectively, educating members and helping them understand what to expect. Most people don't know what to expect from their AG, what to ask for, and most people don't know the name of their U.S. House representative. But let me tell you, I'm lucky in Washington State. The average person, if you want to get a hold of your city council member or your state house rep, you can probably get a sit down with them and coffee. And creating that environment is achievable. And Indivisible is in a great position to help make it happen and to decide what laws are getting passed.
Yeah, we have a little bit more trouble with that here with the political machines, but there is, definitely we have. You always have more opportunity to have a relationship with your lawmakers that are closer to you, and I think, and we're trying to use that more and more. That use that pressure, use that power. Any other questions that anybody has want to put into the chat for us? I'll just see if there's anything I missed here.
And I want to tell people too, by the way, at buymeacoffee.com/VER, we have tons of free downloadable PDFs of model legislation, booklets that are a 20, 30-minute read, my books that are all available as free PDFs in the shop for $0. And some of you might be interested in the Policies That Pass booklet, which just has dozens of policies that can be passed at the city, state, county level that would substantively improve the lives of people in that community. And you're fighting fascism when you do something locally and improve the lives of people. Buymeacoffee.com/VER. Also, we have physical books and other merch available at the existentialistrepublic.com. And yeah.
So, Chris, I think just because people probably, it's THEER, correct?
Yes.
The
Yeah.
Existentialist Republic. So the word ER, all in one word. And the link to I think the link that I put in the follow-up email that just will come out directly from Mobilize within the next hour and a half, 2 hours, has the link to Chris's Substack. That's titled Federalism for Anti-Fascists. And if you go to that, then you can really find all this other stuff. If you just link, if you click on Existentialist Republic and you get to his dashboard on Substack and so on. But I'll put some more direct information and links in the follow-up email. And I'm not 100% sure the video will be done as soon as possible, probably not till tomorrow, maybe not till Friday, but we'll get the video done and get that out so anybody who wants to share it is able to do that. It doesn't look like we have any other particular questions, Chris. So I really, really appreciate you joining us. When you said in your Substack, I'm willing to talk to indivisibles, like, good, I have the network you need to talk to. So I had approached the Indivisible 1NJ group at that point 2.5, 3 weeks ago. And that was before all this stuff happened with Delaney and so on. So I think maybe there's some ideas of things that we can sort of work on and leverage a little bit. Because it is really frustrating seeing all that go on.
Well, and I want to encourage people, if your organization ever wants to reach out for help, just, the Rubik's Cube of public policy is my passion, creating legislation that can improve the lives of people on any of those tiers. If you want to read the academic work, it's on SSRN. You just Google
I'll
SSRN. That's a database for
I'll
working
provide the link
papers.
for that. I'll provide the link
Thank
for that.
you.
And you can do Chris a big favor, because if you download that paper, you don't have to read it if you can't get through it, because it's a little more academic. It's 125 pages. It's a PDF. You don't have to pay anything for it, but it helps Chris because he's going to be applying to the Yale Law Review to try to get his paper accepted for publication. So you will help him if you do that, so we can get these ideas out to more people.
Yeah, it moves it up the rankings in SSRN and shows that this work has interest. And so, yeah, just downloading the PDF sends a signal that this is important work. So, yeah, thank you, everybody.
So, all right. Well, again, thanks so much, Chris. And I'm going to turn off the recording. Thanks everybody for
Yeah.
joining us.
Oh, one last thing too. Anyone is welcome. My last book, which is available for free at the Buy Me a Coffee shop, is also available in physical copies on Amazon and on our website, not through Amazon. And it is titled "Toppling Tyrants: A Field Guide to Dismantling American Fascism." And my new book comes out in the next few weeks, and it will be titled "American Reformation."
Great. I'm going to
Thanks,
stop the
everybody.
recording there.